Hi again. I have another recommendation for Basic Christian Library. This one's not written by a Christian though. It's by a non-practicing Jew who happens to be was until he died just a couple of years ago, America's foremost literary critic, a self-described Gnostic. But he wrote this fascinating book which I read back in 2017, The American Religion. The subtitle is The Emergence of the Post-Christian Nation. I thought his take on American religion as an outsider, a non-Christian, was most refreshing and certainly different than anything else I'd read on the subject before. About this book, The Village Voice says, penetrating, exasperating, and entertaining. Bloom has written his book to raise Cain, and by the end of it, Cain is up and about and preaching to hundreds. The Washington Post said, brilliantly successful. Bloom exposes, as scarcely anyone has before, an eccentricity at our spiritual center. I've done another video, which I'll link at the end, on this book, which I recorded shortly after reading it. I was so thrilled with his analysis. And here's his take, Chapter 9, on Jehovah's Witnesses. And his head is Jehovah's Witnesses against the American religion. He tends to have some affection for almost all of the subjects in this book, including Pentecostalism, Christian Science, Mormonism, Southern Baptist, African American churches in general, and a few more. But the ones he seems to like the least are Jehovah's Witnesses, and here's his reasons. Every national faith is bound to call forth its antitype, and ours has produced its antithesis in the peculiarly stark phenomenon of the Jehovah's Witnesses. As a sect, they could have begun only in the United States, and indeed they represent the likely final upsurge of 19th century American Adventism. The Millerite fiasco of 1843-44, when the world did not end, led to the Seventh-day Adventism of Ellen Harmon White, which we have seen as a positive version of the American religion, despite its origins. But Jehovah's Witnesses, moving out of much the same source, was and remains an altogether different movement, violently dissenting from everything that is distinctively American, whether in government, religion, or economic matters. All these are assigned to Satan and are set aside, even as the witnesses await the end of all things. Jehovah's Witnesses take their start from Charles Taze Russell, who had gone through Presbyterianism and Congregationalism, but found himself only when he encountered Adventist preaching. Convinced that the second coming would be spiritual rather than fleshly, Russell abandoned the Adventists and prophesied that a 40-year harvest period would go from 1874 through 1914, after which the Gentile times would end. The world did not end in 1914, but World War I began, which saved the movement. Russell, a fairly brazen impostor, nevertheless did not seek to tyrannize over his fellow Bible students, as then they were called. At his death in 1916, the movement passed to its legal advisor, Joseph F. Rutherford, a sort of millenarian Tamerlane, who ruled it from 1917 through 1938. Well, I think he's mistaken there. It's 1941, of course, that Rutherford died. Today there are about 3 million witnesses here and throughout the world, at the least, not counting almost as many peripheral adherents. The book comes out in 1992, by the way. 3 million then. Unlike the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists, and many Pentecostals and fundamentalists, the witnesses remain fiercely expectant of the imminent end time. With the year 2000 coming so soon, they are unlikely to lose their zest, despite their perpetual self-mystifications as to dating the apocalypse. The Jehovah of the Witnesses is a solitary majesty rather than the first person of a trinity. In contrast to him, Jesus is a God, but not God. And though Jehovah is the universal Father to us as to Jesus, he is not a particularly loving Father. Power, not love, is his true attribute always. What this Jehovah seeks is supremacy and a universal acknowledgement of his sway. The Jehovah of the Witnesses is remarkably like the Jehovah that the ancient Gnostics satirized and opposed, but where the Gnostics dissented, the Witnesses worship. What this Jehovah most wishes is his ultimate victory at Armageddon, in order to establish his name forever. The mission of Christ is not so much to redeem mankind as it is to help celebrate and vindicate the power of Jehovah. The power of Jehovah is the obsessive concern of the witnesses. So intense is this exaltation of power in the witnesses' writings that I must categorize it as pathological. By the criterion I have proposed for religious criticism, Jehovah's Witnesses is certainly the most dubious movement among our country's indigenous faiths. To find its irreducible spirituality is an agonizing quest. Mrs. Eddy's writings, that is, Christian Science, would require translation to achieve coherence, but they offend only one's sense of reality. The writings of Russell and of Rutherford offend anyone's sense of human dignity, provided such a sense exists. They propose a theocratic fascism that is not mitigated by assigning the dictatorship to a tyrant they call Jehovah. Why then did Jehovah's Witnesses spring up in the United States? And why does it retain a distinctively American aura? This most extreme of all millenarian cults had to emerge from the most apocalyptic of nations, and our country continues to see itself of the world as the world's redeemer. Fiercely unpatriotic, the Witnesses subtracted from American millenarianism only America. Ahlstrom gives the Witnesses as his prime example of what he calls radical Adventism. For the Witnesses, the end time already has come, in 1975, when the 6,000 years of human existence were completed. But so radical is their Adventism that they continue to abide in hope, though what they regard as hope most among us would call by another name. This is not to deprecate the belief in the rapture of many American fundamentalists, but rather to suggest that rapture for Jehovah's Witnesses is not necessarily going to be rapture for everyone else. The intricacies of apocalyptic arithmetic are too ponderous for the wings of wit. One's mind sinks under them. Even if one were to expound this aspect of Jehovah's Witnesses, there would be inevitable misrepresentation, because the movement has not told one story, and one story only, about these matters. It's appropriate that the best book on the subject, by M. James Penton, should be entitled Apocalypse Delayed. Most of us doubtless feel that a delayed apocalypse is the best kind, but in the pure good of theory, the Witnesses would not agree. The disappointments of the movement began with 1878 and have been regularly repeated up to the extraordinary disappointment of 1975. The coming change keeps coming, and the Witnesses are not exactly of the temperament of the proverbial rabbi who is at work planting a flower when told by an excited disciple that the Messiah has come. Being a sage, the rabbi finished planting the flower before going off to check the report. Jehovah's Witnesses are at the opposite extreme from the most Jewish of all writers, Franz Kafka. The Messiah will come only when he is no longer necessary. He will come only on the day after his arrival. He will come not on the last day, but on the very last. That's Kafka, of course. Kafka goes on planting the flower. The Jehovah's Witnesses now believe that human existence ended in 1975. Now, I'm not sure that's Penton's take. I'll have to recheck him, but obviously it's a strange note that Harold Bloom thinks the Witnesses sound by getting past the 6,000 years of the millennium and just dropping the subject. And I think I can remember when I was in that seemed to be the case. They've dropped the subject after that embarrassment. Once again, nothing in this book is meant to discredit even the most extravagant of American religious beliefs. The night before writing these pages, that is March 13, 1991, I walked into my kitchen in New Haven, idly switched on the television, and was bemused at breaking into a clerical discussion of the precise relation between the aftermath of the Persian Gulf War and the texts of Daniel and Revelation. The Reverend Pat Robertson and guest clergymen were calibrating the fall of Babylon, that is Saddam Hussein, in terms of the sacred arithmetic. Many millions of Americans of varied denominations have been expecting Armageddon, and still are, in the shape of a Russian-Arab assault upon the state of Israel. A trust in biblical inerrancy must have its consequences. and Jehovah's Witnesses remain only the most extreme wing of a mental habit that is prevalent among an enormous percentage of us. What makes the Jehovah's Witnesses different is not their expectation of destruction, but their violent hatred of what will be destroyed, which is to say, our country, our world, our common planet. The passion for destruction may be a creative passion, as the anarchist Bakunin insisted, but in the Witnesses it is not creative of anything. There are no positive elements in existence that the Witnesses seek to salvage. They wish to see all of us vanish, and as quickly as possible. I'll do some more of this chapter next time. For this time, let's link the first Bloom video, which I shot very shortly after reading this excellent analysis. Harold Bloom, The American Religion